It's time for our speaker, Sara Lamar. She's with the Swan Valley Connections, and she'll be talking about rare forest carnivores monitoring.
Exciting. You guys hear me? I'm so happy to be here. This is my first Flathead Audubon meeting. And, you know, in the Swan Valley, we do our Christmas bird count and then our global big day. And we have like a group of 5 really hardcore birders, and sometimes we get as many as 10. So this is an amazing turnout, and I'm really excited to be here. I know a lot of you knew June Ash and her husband Rod, and I got to spend a little bit of time with June, and so I know you guys had a lot of really nice things to say about her. So I'm also really excited to be here for that connection as well. And so I work for Swan Valley Connections. I'm the education director, and I've been with the organization for just about 10 years now, which feels kind of wild, but really excited to talk about some of the work that I've really loved being a part of with the organization, and that is what we call our Rare Carnivore Monitoring Project, and sometimes Rare Forest Carnivore Project, Carnivore Project. If you're aware of Swan Valley Connections, you've heard us talk about it in kind of various ways. And so I am going to talk about what we've learned since this work started in about 2012. And so this work takes place in the southwestern crown of the continent. I'm sure many of you have heard this term before. The entire crown, of course, is this yellow outline, and it was George Bird Grinnell who first referred to this area as the crown, with Glacier being the jewel of the crown. And so if you're not totally familiar with your geography, I'll help you out. Oh, I guess I have a laser pointer down. We'll see if that works. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So here is the Swan Valley, right? And, you know, we spend a lot of our time in the upper Swan Valley, but as an organization, we really are trying to make more of an effort to work in the lower part of our watershed as well. And when I talk about the southwest crown, this is this little boot, this red outline, and you can think of it as just south of Swan Lake there, all the way down into Lincoln. And this is, you know, the part of the Blackfoot just before Gold Creek. And so this, what does my notes say? About twice the size of Rhode Island, I believe. This 1.5 million acres. So a pretty big landscape, the Southwest Crown. And this is the area that we're asking the question, what is going on with our rare forest carnivores? And so this is a map. I know it's a little hard to see, but this is showing now again our Southwest Crown outline. And then all this hash mark is what is marked as lynx critical habitat. Lynx are listed as threatened in the Endangered Species Act. And at the time of their listing, or a little bit later, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designated critical habitat for these animals. And if you see, this is Southwest Crown, Bob Marshall Wilderness, of course into Glacier, and then a little bit up in here. And so this Southwest Crown is the southern extent of our native lynx population. There's been a reintroduced population in Colorado, but in terms of our native Canada lynx, this is about as far south as we know them to go. And then now I've got our Wolverine, and this green area. So all of this map is showing the brown and the green was modeled as suitable Wolverine habitat. And the green is where they are currently occupied. And so I'm showing you these two because, of course, lynx and wolverine are the main focus of this rare carnivore monitoring project. And I'm going to take a step back for a second. And just, again, this Southwest Crown, what's also special about this landscape is around 2010, there was an opportunity for 10 places in the country to apply for funding for collaborative work. And so this was a huge pot of money. It was like $10 million from the federal government. And the Southwest Crown Collaborative was one of those 10 places in the country that received this funding. And so that was a huge seed that started this carnivore monitoring project. And so for a long time, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, other managing agencies had these questions about lynx and wolverine, but not a great funding source to answer it. And so this funding was called CFLRP, if you love acronyms, and it stands for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project. There won't be a test later, so you don't have to remember that, but I have a feeling I have some biologists in the room who might grill me on things like that, so I want to make sure to get it out there. Again, with this big pot of money, the key was collaboration. So the Forest Service had to work with other groups to put together, and the other key word in this funding was monitoring, right? All of our agencies do really good work, lots of restoration, lots of novel research, but how often do we get to go back and monitor, right? How often do we get to go back and see the trends of how it's impacting our plants, our wildlife, on and on. And so those were the key pieces that brought together this carnivore monitoring project. So back to our focal species. We got lynx and we have wolverine. And so I'm going to come back to those guys in a second, but I mentioned that collaboration piece. So I want to make sure I talk about all the partners because of course I'm coming to you from Swan Valley Connections. My name's not up there. We'll have to work on that. But key players were the Forest Service. This is U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station at Missoula. They not only process all of our genetic work, but also if you're familiar with John Squires, has a ton of research into lynx and some in wolverine. Mike Schwartz has done a lot of wolverine work in helping bring the foundational research to get to these questions. And the Wilderness Society was heavily involved. BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, came to us as a partner later and had us survey some of their lands. So that was great to expand the area. And then University of Montana. So Corey Davis was the coordinator of all these funds and wrote, if you've read any of the reports from this work, you've read Corey's work. So grateful for him. And then of course, the Nature Conservancy, similar to the Bureau of Land Management, they came to us as a later partner. We also surveyed their lands. And then, what am I missing? Blackfoot Challenge, of course. Eric Graham and others were key field people that helped go collect this data. So, as we talk about all the cool things we learned, don't forget these people because they were critical in making it all happen. Let's see. Okay, so the objectives. We wanted to better understand the distribution and abundance. Okay, this was never really meant to be a population estimate. We are starting, if you retired biologists in the room maybe, you know that our fundamental question is just where are they and about how many are there compared to others, right? We're not quite ready to say we want to know exactly how many lynx are in this area. We just don't even know where they are. And that was especially true for wolverine at the time. I wasn't quite around when this first started, but I've heard some really fun stories about the folks who went to the field. You know, we're kind of all sitting around and drinking a beer and they're like, how many wolverine do you think we have? Like 8? And, you know, taking bets like that. And when we started to get this data and we were starting to see like 35 individual wolverine, everyone was pretty shocked about what we actually had because no one really knew before this work started going on. Facilitate adaptive management, right? And so we wanted to understand where these animals were and information in a way that could go right back to the managers, right? The Forest Service, who's the major land manager where these critters live, how can they make decisions that will in real time affect these animals? Develop a methodology. And so I'll talk about in a minute, but you all know that in conservation, our resources are very limited, so time and money. And so how can we develop a methodology to learn about multiple species, right? Often we go out and we ask questions about one animal or another, and we have a very tailored way to get that information. We wanted to say, how can we go out and collect information about these animals and, as I'll talk about, others? And complement ongoing research. I mentioned that of John Squires and Mike Schwartz. And now we're seeing, and of course, elephant in the room, wolverine just got listed. Did everybody know that? This is last week, whatever, last 10 days or so. Wolverine are now on the endangered species list. And so there's way more research that has started in the time that we started this project, and now there will be even more, right? As Fish and Wildlife Service will have to write a recovery plan for that species. And identify travel routes, and of course, raise community support and awareness. These are not, well, I think they're charismatic, but they're not the charismatic megafauna that we necessarily associate with Western landscapes, right? Anyone else in the conservation field knows that we spend a ton of time talking about grizzly bears and elk and wolves and mountain lion and all the other animals that get a lot of our attention. But because these guys are naturally low abundance, they're just naturally rare. And also they live in places that are really hard to get to. We don't hear a lot about them in the public. There's lots of people that when you tell them there was a wolverine, they think you're talking about, you know, a comic book character, right? Most people don't know that we actually have that animal here in Montana. And so the more we can get out and talk about them, the better, right? So back to our focal species. You've heard me talk a lot about lynx and wolverine, but the truth is we actually started out this project asking questions about 3 species. And so fisher are unfortunately the critters that we end up not talking about so much, and I'll give you a spoiler alert, that's because we found 0 in our decade of monitoring. We haven't found any fisher in the Southwest Crown. And I'll talk a little bit about that more, but you'll see my emphasis on lynx and wolverine because we do know a lot more about them. And so I mentioned wolverine were just listed, and so before that they were petitioned many times. And so again, folks were aware of their conservation status and wanting to learn more about them. Lynx have been listed, since, does anybody know? 2009 comes to mind. No, I think earlier. We'll say 90s. A while ago. Someone can Google it on their phone and yell at me if you get it. And then fisher have been also petitioned several times, but they're not listed. In lots of states, they're species of concern or conservation status, but they aren't federally listed at this time. And these are, and of course, again, sensitive species for the Forest Service, our major land manager. And as I mentioned, their habitat is primarily on our public lands, right? That we don't find them often in the valley bottom where private land tends to be. And so it is beholden to our managers, right, who manage those lands for us to take care of these species. And so they want to know a lot more about them. And then climate change. And so there's a couple of different pieces here. Canada Lynx right here. These guys are different from their distant related cousins, the bobcat, in that they have these huge, huge feet, right? They are specially snow adapted and they're very specialized. Almost over 90% of their diet is the snowshoe hare. And that means that when other carnivores like coyotes or bobcat are able to get into their habitat, lynx are not good at competing against them. And so lynx are very vulnerable when snowpack decreases, that other animals can get into their space. There's been work to understand kitten mortality of lynx, and mountain lions were responsible for almost like 1/3 of lynx kitten mortality. So they don't fare well when other animals can get into there from competition, right? And so they really need that thick layer of snow to thrive. And so one thing we're seeing that could be problematic with climate change is when we get more of these rain on snow events, and then we get these thick, crusty layers on top of the snow, coyotes can really get into some high elevations that they otherwise wouldn't access, right? That deep snow makes it hard for them to travel on their small paws. But now that we get this really crusty snow, and I've seen this on the valley bottom even, that their instances of hunting deer are much higher. They're much more successful predators when they have this ice layer, which again, and mountain lions too, right? They have bigger feet than coyotes certainly, but they're not snow adapted animals. But certain conditions in the winter with climate change are going to allow them to march up in elevation. And so we are nervous about what are our lynx going to do when that happens. Wolverine, the current science tells us that wolverine require snow for denning. They're also snow adapted animals. They've got large feet compared to their body size, and claws that act like crampons, right? They can climb up the ice. And they are really good competitors in that they're one of the only animals that has the jaw strength to crush big bones. They're really great scavengers. But our main concern right now is, will they den when there isn't snow? One of the problems is that we also have very few dens ever documented for wolverine. And so that is a huge important area of research. And there's also thoughts that just like mountain goats, that wolverine might overheat easily, and they need, again, those permanent snow fields to take refugia from the really hot summer temps. And so then a little bit of biology about our fisher. So fish are really interesting. One thought, especially where I live and work in the Swan Valley, is that maybe fisher were never really abundant. And so again, low abundance. And then if you weren't aware, in the Swan Valley, Plum Creek Timber Company was a major landowner there and harvested a ton of what we might consider the old growth, right? And fisher are really an old growth dependent species. They den and give birth in large cavities, right? Just as those are critical for so many of our birds, critical for a lot of animals like fisher, pine marten, and things like that. So habitat loss might be one reason for their decline. Now, fisher are really successful in places like California and the East Coast. They're not really, in California, they have some issues, but on the East Coast, they're not a conservation concern at all. And while these other two animals are really dependent on deep snow, fisher actually do not do well in deep snow. They have relatively small feet for their body size, and which is why that old growth forest that might hold more of the snow in the canopy might be beneficial to them. So again, habitat loss, and maybe they were never really abundant in the Southwest Crown. We just aren't sure. There was a reintroduction of fisher in 1959 in the Swan Valley. And one of the reasons we think that was really pushed for is because wolverine are successful hunters of porcupine. And if you know, again, the Swan Valley, the logging industry was really important. And so perhaps people really wanted to see successful, right, predator of porcupine introduced so that the porcupine would stop eating a lot of the trees and causing weird growth and things like that. We also don't really have porcupine anymore. And so is there a link between those two things? I don't know. And we don't really have great answers for that. And I would love some of our biologists to ask more questions about where our porcupine went. Because they're certainly prolific in eastern Montana, but throughout western Montana, we really don't see them like we once did. So that's your hard and fast biology of those three species. I'm sure we'll talk more as it comes up. But know that we also, while we're out there, we're collecting information on other carnivores. And so I'll show you a little bit about pine marten at the end here. And I have a couple of maps on bobcat. And then animals like wolves and mountain lion. We were mostly interested in collecting that data while we were out there, in that maybe someone could look back later and analyze how the presence of those animals, you know, did we, in areas we saw wolves, did we not see lynx, right? Questions like that. But we haven't really dug into that data at this time. So those are our focal species. How blurry is that? That's not terrible. It's not terrible. So this is like textbook 101, what not to do when you're making a PowerPoint, right? Of all of that text to put on the slide. But I did really like this because it just gives us a little comparison of our three focal species. And it shows you really clearly what we know and what we don't know. So if you don't even want to read all these words, you can just look at this color code up here and see that this dark gray are not well understood. And just look at how much we don't understand specifically about wolverine and fisher. So what happens when you get listed as a species under the Endangered Species Act? People are suddenly compelled to know a lot more about you. So you can see with lynx, we've been asking more questions for longer because, again, the federal government has a responsibility to recover that species. So they've been asking those questions. We're going to see this change now that wolverine are listed. Not fast, but now there will be much more funding and attention to answering some of these questions. So again, general habitat needs, specific habitat needs, not a lot well understood. And if you want to read this in more detail, I did pull this right out of our final report on our website. So I'm going to skip it. I don't expect you to read it all, but a nice summary. So So what did we do? How did we actually go out and collect this information about these animals? I'm sorry if you didn't come here to see roadkill and trees. I think that's my only graphic picture, maybe. Hopefully it's not too graphic. But we use a two-pronged method, bait stations and track surveys. Now, we talk about this project as being non-invasive, but I do want to acknowledge that bait stations are like a little invasive, right? We are potentially changing the movement of those animals. We believe that we're not changing the movement of those animals on a large scale, right? Especially for an animal like a wolverine. If it smells meat, it's gonna go there, right? Even if it was a mile away. Now, again, are we getting wolverine from Glacier Park running down into the Swan Valley? Probably not at that scale. So, you know, again, a little invasive. And another good example of that is when John Squires was studying lynx and Sealy, he would ask us, please don't put bait stations in that area because he has collars on those cats that are picking up really fine scale locations and he doesn't want to see them hanging out at our tree, right? That's not very helpful. So again, non-invasive, but like a little invasive for the bait stations. I think it's important to, you know, be transparent about that. So what we like about the bait stations, multi-species, right? So we collect roadkill deer, and that's been really interesting for a lot of reasons. Mostly that we hand our interns machetes and ask them to, you know, go out and pick dead deer on the side of the highway. But also in seeing where, we've learned a lot on where we see roadkill, right? And where we can find it. And then of course, when CWD really came online, that also impacted how we picked up roadkill, you know, in accordance with that and not moving carcasses. So we get a beautiful deer hindquarter, hopefully, and we secure it to the tree. And we want to secure it there pretty well because we're probably not going to be back for another 2 weeks. And then we cover this tree. See these little brushes down here? Those are the wire brushes that you might use to clean your rifle, right? So we call them gun brushes. And those things, if you've never cleaned a rifle, they're really like thick wire, right? And so anything that with fur that runs up this tree is going to leave us a really nice DNA sample when it goes to snack on this deer quarter. So lynx, wolverine, fisher. I don't have the slide that shows everything we've ever gotten at a bait station, but we have a video of a fox climbing up there, skunks. You'll be amazed at the animals that can climb. We also can only do this work in the window that grizzly bears are sleeping. And so we have a pretty strict protocol that we either pull everything by April 1st or when the first grizzly track is observed in the area. And we start this work after the new year. And so we try to give a pretty good buffer and we've never had a problem. Although that's what everyone who has a bear conflict always says to me when we go visit them. Never had a problem until this one time. No, in all seriousness, we take that very seriously in this work. And so genetic, and then our other method is track surveys. And you'll see in a minute why we think this two-pronged approach is really important. And so with the track surveys, when we're on our snowmobiles and we have miles to cover to get to this spot, along the way, we're stopping and we're identifying tracks. And then not only just on the way to our base stations, but we'll also make sure that we cover enough ground in our grid cell. And so you'll see what I mean in a minute with the grid cell. So again, track surveys are truly non-invasive, right? We are just collecting information about animals as they behaved unknowingly, that we would come and then, you know, look at their tracks. Cost effective, right? We have snowmobiles. Although I will say highly skilled field techs are pretty critical in this. And I'll talk a little bit about that also. And we can cover a pretty large landscape doing these track surveys. One thing that I think makes this hard to replicate in other areas is that we have an incredible legacy of logging roads to drive our snowmobiles on. And so if you were trying to apply track surveys in another landscape without the roads that we have, that would be pretty difficult. And while I, for one, as a conservationist, don't love all the roads we have in the landscape. It does make this work possible in a lot of ways. So something to think about there too. Okay, so track surveys. I think here's your first quiz. When people hear this, you know, and you live in Western Montana in the winter, you do lots of tracking, right? And you probably look at tracks like this and you're like, I don't know, I can't see a foot, I'm moving on, right? That's not helpful for me. I don't want to spend my time taking guesses. And we're scientists and we don't take guesses either. But knowing what we know about the way animals move and the patterns they leave on the landscape, we can, with high confidence, identify these tracks. And one of the cool byproducts about this project is because we're collecting genetic samples, I didn't mention that on track surveys. So if I was on my snowmobile at 25 miles an hour, you can see my snowmobile track right there. I see this track and I hit the brakes. I get off and my field tech and we split up on this track. And our goal is to find a scat or a hairball or urine or vomit, anything that we think could contain a genetic sample, and we collect that. And then we send it to the lab. Now, you can imagine if I didn't know my tracks very well, I'd waste a lot of time, right? I'd be stopping very, very often, backtracking who knows what, right? And I want to invest all my time on lynx, wolverine, or fisher. So what am I looking for? I'm looking at these gait patterns. Does anybody, we'll start with this photo. This is Maria mantis. Does anybody recognize Maria? Does anybody know what this animal is? Who wants to guess?
Wolverine.
It's Wolverine. You had a pretty high odds, right? I was probably going to show you a lynx or a Wolverine. And so, did you know that or did you guess?
I knew it.
Tell me how you knew it.
Because the last slide of the footprint,
Uh-huh.
I noticed that it puts its back feet in the same print as its front foot.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so this
So
is,
it looks like a two-legged walker.
yeah, so we'll, so this one, if you notice, there are groups of 3, and then it goes into groups of 2. And weasels are giant slinkies, right? They have long bodies. No other animal is shaped that way. And how do slinkies move, right? They move like this across the landscape. If you've ever watched an ermine or a short tail or a long tail weasel, right? They don't walk. They don't stroll around the landscape. They're bounding, right? They're going up and down, up and down. And so wolverine are giant weasels, right? And so they have options then to move across the landscape in a way that's most efficient for their bodies. They can do something, let's start with this one, because this one, this 2x that we like to call it, this is what you see your ermine doing all winter, right? You're gonna see that 2 fronts hit the ground and 2 hinds, right? Oh, I said that bad. let me be a better teacher. So here are the hinds, right? Leaving the track. The fronts are here, and then those hinds land there again, and the animal gets leverage into the air. Is that a better way to say that? And so we get these groups of 2, right? This animal's bouncing on the landscape. It's making tracks with its front feet. Those hind feet get into the air, land in the same spot, and jump up. It sounds really weird, but if you watch some videos of their moving, it makes more sense. Now this is a 3x diagonal. Again, only our weasels do this. And so, how much do I want to explain this? What we're seeing is, I feel like I have to use my hands, a hind and a hind, a front and a front. I'm not going to get real deep into the mechanics of that, but trust me, only weasels can move this way, and the wolverine is the only weasel big enough, right, to make this track pattern. So this is an example of what we might hit the brakes on and go look for a scat in a sample. And so now back to our genetics. We know that our senior field staff have about a 98% accuracy because of genetics on these track IDs. So we also know sometimes we stop and we think we're pretty sure. We can mark our confidence. And so again, when our field techs mark high confidence, 98% of the time they know what they're doing when they collect that sample. This is our Canada Lynx. And our cats, they don't move like slinkies, right? They like wolves, like deer, they are often walking or trotting. And when our cats walk or trot, right, we can look down and we can often see this is a right side, this is a left side. We're getting groups of 2 again. But this animal, now instead of the hinds and the fronts landing in the same spot, we have what's called an overstep walk. And you guys have seen bear tracks, right? This is something that bears do, an under overstep. Again, because of their anatomy, bears are kind of like sloped down. They have these long back legs and short front legs. They can't step in their own tracks. And so those hinds land out in front. And so cats can do that, or cats can do the reverse where they short step their own tracks. And so this is the front and hind of the left side, front and hind of the right side, front and hind. And then of course there's a snowshoe hare, its favorite snack, running through the tracks. So take our tracking classes if you want to learn more. But I did just want to show the complexity in the tracks that we're working with, right? And so one thing that is part of the work that John Squires did was to also measure the probability of detection for lynx. And he basically measured that if we divide the landscape up into a grid cell pattern, and you survey, I can't remember how many miles, but I think it's like 10 miles in that grid cell, you have like a 92% chance of hitting the lynx if it's in that grid cell. So again, we have good scientific information that if we put enough effort into a certain place and a lynx is there, we should hit its track. That's really helpful if we don't hit a track. It makes us more confident in saying a lynx isn't there, right? Because in wildlife biology, presence is really easy, right? There's the nuthatch, there's, it's there, I see it. But absence can be really hard to feel good about saying, right? Because you don't want to say it's not there if your methods just weren't good enough at finding it. So it's something we want to, be really sure again when we're saying these animals are here or not. So, and then of course, again, we have genetics to support this. So we run around on that track. Oh, I think I went too far. No, I didn't. We go on that track and we find that genetic sample. So those genetic samples not only tell us whether it's a lynx or a wolverine or a red squirrel or a snowshoe hare, it can also tell us male or female and the individual, right? It can tell us the individual. Now I do want to go that way. There we go. Identification. And so sometimes when we get our genetic results, they will get a varied amount. Some percentage of those results will only go to species, and then the lab will take that further, and a smaller percent will usually go to individual and to sex. It depends on the quality of the DNA, right? We all know DNA is degrading rapidly. That's all I know about DNA. I'm definitely not big in the genetic side. And so here's what some of our results look like, and I'm going to show you some maps and more, but this is kind of some of the highlights from our 10-year report. So we found lynx in a total of 56 grid cells. You're going to see those grid cells in a minute, because that's probably meaningless to you at this time. So over the whole decade of this project, we found 109 unique individual lynx. We didn't necessarily find all of those individuals every time we went out and looked, right? Like that's just a sum of all the animals. And also in this time, we don't survey every year. And so when we first started this project in 2012, we surveyed in 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then we took a break because that was our baseline information. And we wanted to set ourselves up to a position when then we could come back and monitor, right, the information that we found. And so 21 and 22 were our monitoring years. We came back and we repeated the survey and said, okay, how does this data now compare to our other data set? Now, in a perfect world, we would have repeated the field season for the same number of times, right, that we did the first time. The reality is that big funding pot I talked about, it ran out. So now our goal, right, is if Forest Service and other agencies find this work important, we now have to go back and find the money for it. But that that big pot of money back in 2010 set us up to be able to go back at least the first time and the second time. And so that would become relevant again with some more of these results. So Wolverine, 61. Again, unique individuals in the whole period. Any one field season, it's about the mid-30s is what we would see for both species. And then that sex ratio is important too. This is especially important with lynx. We were pretty nervous where we had a ton of males and not very many females, but then we realized that a secret there was with the methodology. And I'll mention that more in a second. With Wolverine, you can see it's pretty even, so we feel pretty good about that. And again, no Fisher, 0, not any. We do know that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has found Fisher up in the Cabinet Yaks, and we see them a lot on the Idaho border. They kind of pop over by Lolo, and there's a pretty good population in Idaho on that other side, kind of in that Locksaw country. And again, whether Fisher were abundant, we're not really sure. People often ask me, have we asked the tribes that question? And that's a great question, right? So to my knowledge, no, and that would be a great place to start to say, were Fisher really abundant in this area? You know, what information and stories do you all have? Okay, so this is just snow track surveys, and this shows you our effort. So how much effort we put into collecting this information. So our number of survey days ranged a little bit, but generally from the low 50s to the upper 50s. Again, like I said, after New Year's until the end of March, and some of that might weather. So we don't go out if it's below 0. And we don't go out if it's pretty unsafe, although I've been out in lots of inclement weather. And so that unsafe, you know, if the roads are really bad and you have to go all the way to Lincoln, a couple of things like that might affect this number of survey days. And then number of grid cells, at least once. This number ranges a lot. And I was asking about why it was so low in 2014, because I started, 15 was my first year on the project. And they were telling me that it was such a big snow year in 14, I don't know if any of you remember, that they spent more time digging their snowmobiles out than they did actually riding them. And so if you snowmobile, you know that that's also pretty typical of that. There's our mileage that we're working with. And that's that little miles per grid cell that I mentioned we just keep track of because, again, it helps with that probability of detection that I mentioned with lynx. And so, we don't have a title for this one. It's fun, we can guess. Here's our bait station effort. And so the number of, again, trees that have a deer quarter up in them across that landscape, that's quite a bit, up in the hundreds. And again, number of grid cells with at least one bait station, number of bait stations per grid cell. Again, just really showing you the level of effort that we're putting out there to collect this information. Okay, so here is what that looks like. This is just our 13 to 16, a 4-year chunk. In all these little dots are bait stations, and the red lines don't look like much because it's on this big scale, but you saw the number of miles that we were surveying in the last slide. And then you'll see some of these clusters that are outside that Southwest Crown. And this is the Nature Conservancy land. So if you're familiar with that Gold Creek area, again, they invited us to survey their lands. And this is BLM, the Garnets. Again, they invited us to survey these lands after we had kind of collecting this information. So just showing you across the landscape what that looks like. You'll see, where's the North Fork of the Blackfoot? Is that up in here? We can't snowmobile in the wilderness, of course. And so there was 1 or 2 seasons where we had crews ski in to the North Fork of the Blackfoot to put some base stations. But otherwise, we did not work in the wilderness area. So, Canada Lynx, now we're getting some results. So here are these grid cells I mentioned, and they're 5 by 5 miles. So there's some scale for you. every blue cell is showing you where we had a lynx detection, and the number in the cell is telling you over the course of 4 years how many times we caught a lynx in that cell. By caught, I mean by genetics, not physically caught. And so you can see this is kind of Sealy. There's Lincoln. Here's a little pocket down here, but we don't have a very connected population. I know, it's really sad. We don't have a connected population. And so that was something we were really paying attention to after this first baseline survey. And we'll look at some more lynx maps. I think the next one, yeah. So here is then when we came back and did 2 field seasons, 21 and 22. And look at this. We have a nice connected population. And so the big change was the Swan Valley, particularly the Mission Mountains, really filled in when we came back and looked for lynx. And again, all these 2s just mean that we detected lynx in there the 2 years in a row. And we'll come back in a couple of other maps that might have some answers as to why this is. But just kind of keep in your mind, we still have a couple here and still a couple in the Lincoln range. I think this is in a later slide, but one thing, so I can't remember what time period, early 2000s, they used to be able to trap and collar lynx in the garnets, but we have found that there's no breeding population of lynx down in the garnets. So again, is this a canary in the coal mine of the southern extent of lynx that we're seeing them not here anymore? Is it reflective of management? And so does the BLM need to, think about lynx in a different way than they have? Those are questions that are still out there that this research isn't necessarily meant to answer, but except bring our attention to these things, right? That's what we do with monitoring. So let's look at Wolverine, maybe. Oh, we're gonna look at one more lynx. Oh, and this is an important story to tell. So the green is females, gray is males. And the big thing we realized early on, I mentioned we were nervous about the ratio. We were seeing a lot more males and not very many females. And it turns out males spend a lot of time at our bait stations. Females do not. So, and these numbers are telling you how many animals were detected by method. So comparatively, if we look at bait stations only, we have 59 male cats came to our bait station, but only 12 females. And if you look over at tracks, look how much higher that female ratio is. And so we think what happens is males are pretty dominant. March is also when the lynx breeding season is, and we've heard them do their breeding calls. It's crazy. These males will take naps under this beautiful giving a dead deer tree, and they don't want other animals to go up there, right? They guard them. And so that was impacting how many animals we were seeing in our bait stations. So when we said, okay, let's make sure when we're tracking, if we think we have a female lynx, that we spend extra time getting a sample from that track. And when we did that, we started seeing a much better female ratio. And so these were, again, were females that we were only finding, especially females with kittens, via their tracks, but they weren't going to our bait stations. So you can imagine if you were doing a project where you only had bait stations on the landscape, you might be missing a big part of the story of that population, right? And so again, that's the big story to tell there. And you'll see it's different for Wolverine. But here's Wolverine in their distribution. The first go round, pretty connected. The Mission Mountains are definitely important for both species. We'll see hotspots there. I will say the Swan front, because of snow melting, can be more difficult to survey. So that is something to be aware of our methods that could impact what we see. And especially when we look at Wolverine in the next one, we're gonna see some holes here. And one thing that we can say is, well, one thing we can't say is that Wolverine are declining in the Southwest Crown, right? We don't have enough information to say that. One thing we might be able to say is that because we only took a 2-year look, right? That weather variability that I just mentioned that might make it difficult to survey certain places might impact that, right? If you have 2 low snow years in a row, how much is that impacting where we're seeing those animals? So that's one thing to think about there. But so ideally, we'd have funding and we'd come back, right? And we look at this again. And if we saw an ever shrinking Wolverine distribution, then that would be another data set to say, okay, now we're seeing a trend and we need to pay more attention and ask what's going on here. So I think, how am I doing on time? Nobody knows. Okay, I only have a couple slides left. So here's what that looked like for Wolverine. And it turns out for Wolverine, they love the base stations, right? They are animals that have really strong olfactory senses. They live by their nose, they're scavengers. So if there's something dead out there, we also, to our base stations, we add beaver castor, which is something that trappers use a lot. It's a long distance trapping lure. And we also use another trapping lure that smells terrible. The beaver castor smells really good. It's kind of like vanilla or perfumey. This other one is like, fermented, rotting meat things. And so again, we put that scent on there. And then one thing we also add at the bottom of the tree, we put these little carpet pads that have like these little spikes on them, and we pour catnip oil on them. And sometimes the lynx will come and they'll rub all over it and leave us some nice hair samples with that. So again, takeaway here is that base stations are a pretty good method for Wolverine. Wolverine also travels such huge home ranges, really big, like 200 square miles. And so the tracks only would not be something we would recommend, because you might survey an area, but that Wolverine could be, clear 10 miles down the way and you just missed it kind of on that day. So something to consider there with our methodology.
You're good.
I'm good. Okay, so here's a fun one. So in thinking about how our distribution might have changed between our 2 survey periods. So here's what you're looking at. These red perimeters are wildfires, and we're a little cut off there, but this is 2017. We had a really big fire year, right? You all probably remember the Rice Ridge fire. I remember it because we had a ton of smoke. It was really hard in the Swan Valley and Sealy, of course. The whole town was just covered in smoke. And so pretty big wildfire. This is the Liberty Fire that started on the CSKT side. And I don't remember these names of these Lincoln fires. But again, all 2017, really big fire year. And so this was an opportunity to say, okay, we want to do adaptive management. And we went out and we collected baseline data. And now we had a huge landscape change happen in between our survey periods. So now, that's what the red, so now you're looking at, these are density maps where this purple is showing you high density of lynx detections and Wolverine detections. So this one here is Wolverine. So this, like I said, the Mission Mountains, Wolverine hotspot. Down here outside of Sealy, Wolverine hotspot. And now lynx hotspot out of Sealy, lynx hotspot. And look at that fire perimeter, Liberty Fire hotspot. So this again was an opportunity to say, okay, these fires really overlapped with the preferred areas of our focal species. So where are we going to find them? So I know this one came out blurry for some reason, but now this is when we came back. So 21, 22, fire perimeter still there. All of our, and we switch places. So now lynx are over here. And so look at now, we see that whole density just shift right over into the Swan Valley. And so that might be one reason we're seeing a different distribution of lynx now. However, there also, what you might not know about lynx is that it's not so much in Montana, but in Canada and up further north, snowshoe hare are cyclical in their populations. And so lynx follow that cycle, right? Again, it's not as dramatic as you go south, but what does happen up north is when snowshoe hare populations crash, we get a lot of hungry lynx disperse down south. And so that could also be something happening and why we see lynx so much more on the landscape than we did this first go around. With Wolverine, we also saw a little bit of shift again out of this burn. If you haven't been to the Rice Ridge fire, it was pretty mixed severity, but there are some spots, right? 100% mortality of those trees. And especially when you go back in the winter, there's nothing going on, right? Snowshoe hare need dense, thick cover to hide. Those bunnies are not there anymore. It's just a sea of sticks, right, and snow. And so for those carnivores, it's not, and also the snow depth is really intense. Now, the other part of this story is that in 20 years, that habitat's going to be amazing snowshoe hare and lynx habitat. And so fires are really important of these animals' ecology. It's just that it really shows us how much they need large connected landscapes, right? So that when something like the Rice Ridge fire happens, they can go somewhere else while they wait for that spot to regenerate. And then it's going to be really, really great habitat. And let's see. So let's look a little bit about some of the other species we collected data on. Again, I just have the martin and the bobcat. We're pretty worried about pine marten. I don't know anecdotally if you guys go out and pay attention to some tracks in the winter, but we used to see a pretty even distribution of pine marten throughout the Southwest Crown. Again, that's our smaller weasel. Really, really high value for their fur. You know, people love trapping them, and we're really finding it less and less common to find a pine marten in a lot of places. Habitat could be part of that, right? We mentioned the old growth and the lack of that, or trapping pressure could be a part of that too. We're not sure. This project doesn't tell us why, but this is a pretty big difference to go from this distribution of almost everywhere into these little pockets. And bobcat are interesting in that I mentioned their competition with lynx. Again, I don't have a ton to say about that, except that bobcat have the potential to be more successful with climate change. Although in between these two periods, we kind of saw a lower abundance of bobcat. Bobcat are also trapped, and so that's, you know, important to factor in there. So, almost done. I just want to add that we talked about this gap in between our big field seasons, and our crews have actually been out there every winter since 2012, and we've been working on these other projects that is really exciting, again, to see other partners get excited about this work. And so we mentioned the Nature Conservancy and BLM, and so they've asked us to come out. We also have been working with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. John Squires is collaring lynx right now in old fires. So if you're familiar with Sealy, the Jocko fire, and in the Swan Valley, the Crazy Horse fire, those are each like over 20 years old. And we're finding that the snowshoe hare populations are off the charts because after those fires, we get that really thick lodgepole regeneration. You see, I'm sure the same thing in Glacier. And that's where the lynx love to come in. So again, that might have been like a moonscape when it first happened, but now it's a great place for lynx, especially females and kittens, to be, as the bunny populations are really high. And so again, John, we're doing track surveys that involve, we follow lynx tracks and then we stop every so often and we record vegetation data. And so we're looking at tree species, tree diameter, all those questions. And then John has these cats collared as well. And so he can look on a larger scale of how they're moving, you know, and overlay that with different GIS models and things like that. So that's been a project we've been working on. And we also helped, the state of Montana is now doing a wolverine monitoring project where they have much larger grid cells than us, and they sort of randomize how they sample those grid cells. And this helped, again, it was 4 different states involved. I think there's more states involved now, like maybe Utah's doing it too. And so this was really great to see these Western states. I mean, they probably knew the writing was on the wall with all these Wolverine petitions, for them to get out and do the first ever population estimate. And then we also know from this work is that the Southwest Crown has the highest density of Wolverine in Western Montana. And so that was pretty cool to compare. I mentioned that we found that lynx have blinked out from those Garnet Mountains on BLM lands. And then again, when we're doing this work, we're contributing to the master database of known individuals. And we're really hoping that this data will inform this post-fire management for Wolverine and lynx habitat. As again, with climate change, we know fire is going to be a not that it isn't already, but an even bigger part of our lives and the animals' lives. So I think I've talked about this. We did see Fish and Wildlife Service use these data in different listing decisions. There was a movement to have lynx removed from the list, and that was then turned around, and so they're still listed. And again, having other groups and agencies with land have interest in this work and ask us to continue the survey has been really exciting. There have been efforts in the Sealy Swan to do much more large scale landscape planning instead of the Forest Service going from project to project. And they're really thinking about how do we use this information when we're doing that. So, yeah, okay, that's it. So benefits of collaborative work, I probably don't need to tell this group of people. There's impossible to do this work alone. All those partners I mentioned at the beginning, really, really critical. It's been a really exciting way to also bring work to local people and new field techs in the field and build the skill set of tracking is something we're passionate about, as well as these animals. And pretty critical in what I described as a world of limited resources. Every partner just brings so much, and so to be able to complete a project that's so much greater than the sum of all of our parts, we're really, really grateful for that. So products, you can check out our website, and we actually have a final report that's a combined version of this, and that's up there. You can also check out the Southwest Crown Collaborative does have its own website that will have these reports. And a couple of different publications have come out of this. Here's one about our methodology. And we've done some presentations at the North America Wildlife Tracker Conference. I bet you didn't know that there were tracking conferences, but there are. And I recommend everyone attend virtually. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, well, I would love to take questions. And while I do, can we play this video in the background? I don't know if I can do it.
Just go forward one, it should.
Oh, there we go. So questions? Gave you so much information. I know this is, we might rather watch this.
How did you get that video?
So we, not at every single one of our bait stations, but at certain hotspots, we put cameras. And so Swan Valley Connections runs, we really don't have that many, maybe 20 or so cameras. We have a mountain of videos on our website and our YouTube channel of not just these animals, but everything from grizzly bears and wolves. We had one on a fox den this spring, so there's lots of little baby foxes running around. You can see how incredibly athletic they are. I know. We put these, we call them dangles. Cats are very visual predators. We also hang CDs. So we have a use for CDs as everyone's like throwing them away. And again, the spinning reflection or the hanging hide is just a little extra invitation for these visual predators to come in and investigate. Whereas Wolverine, if they smell it, they're going. They don't need to see anything interesting. When they trap lynx for research, they'll put like a bird wing in the trap. You know, again, anything with motion is gonna inspire them to go check it out. So you can really see those huge feet. Lynx are relatively small animals. Do I do have volume? This is doing the breeding call. I'm not gonna make that sound. I almost did for a second and I was like, I'm gonna hold together my pride. But you can check on our website. It's a wild, wild sound. It's not something you think a cat would do. Again, Wolverine can actually eat these bones where a lot of animals give up on that. Oh, this is a little male-female interaction. Yeah. We've always wondered, you know, luckily our base stations are pretty remote. But how freaky it would be to be walking in the woods and see all these deer feet like hanging in a tree.
Wow.
There's rubbing on the tree. And so most of you have maybe, well, you're a bird group, maybe a lot of you don't have cats. But you know, they do that really sweet thing where they rub up against you. They're actually scent marking you, right? They have scent glands in their cheeks. And so we see mountain lions will do it too. It's a fun sign to look for on the landscape if you're really keen, or actually I found most of them from my dog. Smells a spot in the tree and I look and I see clumps of hair, and those are places where mountain lions come and repeatedly rub their cheek to leave that scent. Wolverine are really hard on our bait stations also. They can dismantle it pretty quickly. And again, we want multiple animals to climb the tree while we're gone. So it also helps to hang these things so that they'll keep going up even if the deer quarter is gone. And then, you know, they hang out here.
Is that the catnip that they're trying to?
Yeah, yeah, it could be. You know, there might be little like parts of hide that get buried too. This one looks like he's had some catnip. What do I tether the bait with? Yeah, we use, I don't know what gauge wire, but we use like a pretty strong wire. And then if we hang things away from the bait station, we will use like a fishing line that's pretty clear, so they can't see what's holding it together. But yeah, and if we've done a good job, see how there's still the bone up there? If we've done a really good job, then we can take that bone off and use the same wire to rewrap it. You know, we've often have people ask, like, do you ever get an animal that gets stuck or hung up on the wire or anything? And we've never had that. And so that's another, you know, if we do a really good job, we've cinched it down really, really tight, that there's no way that they can like get into the wire. And so that's another skill that gets perfected when you do, you know, 100 of these things.
So how do trappers discriminate? So these aren't when they're
Yeah.
out.
So that's a great question. For bobcat trappers, well, the first thing, and if there's any trappers in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, I think some people use live traps. So that's one way. If you use a live trap, you could let out a lynx. And lynx are a bit bigger. And so bobcats can get into smaller sets if you use a live trap. Then for something like a foothold trap, you know, the pan tension, although bobcat and lynx are a pretty similar weight. And so I think bycatch does happen. And again, with a foothold trap, ideally a trapper could release that animal. Of course, sometimes their foot is damaged beyond. Yeah, and you know, the big thing that we worry about is how wolf trapping might impact lynx. And we haven't heard of any bycatch with that. Of course, you probably wouldn't hear a lot about it. You know, the other big part is that there is some elevation range where bobcat exists on a lower elevation band. But no, it's certainly a problem. And I'm not sure how the state makes a good argument for that, because again, if there's any threat to these animals because they're listed, right, there is opportunity for litigation. So yeah, that's a great question. I would love to. I haven't read the trapping regs, and so there might be something in the regulations that helps that. But yeah, I know someone who caught a wolverine in their wolf trap, and they were able to release it and let it out. And again, that was a leg hold trap and not a snare. So I guess that, of course, with snaring, We were majorly, oh, he was spraying right there, concerned about how, because snaring is completely indiscriminate, right? And, you know, you can control the height of your snare, and then also there's no opportunity to release the animal, right? It's lethal. Yeah. And with the listing of Wolverine, I don't know if that is going to impact any of the trapping seasons and regulations again, because the state will have to prove that they're doing whatever they can to protect Wolverine. So.
When I post this, your talk here, I can go ahead and have links to, links, not LYN.
The less exciting kind of links.
Yeah.
Although they could be links to links.
They could be links,
Yeah.
links.
Yeah. I will say, we also in the time of our project, the Wolverine trapping season did close. And so when we started, there was still a Wolverine trapping season. And there is, okay, don't ask me the rationale, but there is a fisher trapping season, but the quota is 0. I don't know, but so that was interesting also to see in those first 4 years of our project. We did from year to year see an increase in Wolverine that we were finding. Oh, there's that little slinky. So then once they get the hide, they just kind of play with it. One thing you'll want to check out on our website, is anyone familiar with the Whiz Pops? No, they are a band who writes children's songs, and they have a Wolverine song, and we collaborated on a music video with them, and we paired their song to Wolverine trail camera footage. So it's very exciting. Look at
Goodness.
there. So do you see how that he just moved right across the landscape, that like bouncing, just like this little guy. Oh, and there's our snowshoe hare.
Living Davis.
I know. You know, they will chew on the carpet pads. There's we put the catnip oil on right there. And I don't know what it is, but the bunnies come and they chew on those. Look, he's got a strategy. He's gonna go in the next tree and then jump over. Oh, it abandoned the plan.
When you find a hair sample, can you tell just by looking at about whether it's a Wolverine?
Yeah, I feel pretty good about lynx versus Wolverine. Generally, I feel good about bobcat versus lynx, but I would still send it in and trust the lab. We, you know, again, like ermine are pretty clear with the really, really short white hairs. And because sometimes we have tracks to the tree, but sometimes it's snowed so much we don't have tracks, right? Again, I've seen skunk, and you know, their tails was like a black hair, you know, like this long. So there's a lot of times that we can tell, and we'll choose not to send it to the lab. Another thing you'll see, of course, this one you can't see super well, but if you look at the tree, you'll see how it's scratched really dramatically. That's also, there's our skunk, indicative of one of our species where some of those smaller animals can't scratch the tree. So if we, because every sample costs money, if we're really confident it wasn't a focal species, we might not send it to the lab. But if there's any question, we'll let the lab decide.
What lab do you use?
The Rocky Mountain Research Lab in Missoula. Yeah. Really working it.
Have you used trail cams to identify individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't do that work. If you, the next Wolverine you see, if you look at the chest pattern, there is some work that, let's believe that is an individual identifier. So you may have heard that there's some work to identify tigers, right, by their stripes, like a fingerprint, and even AI might help us do this. So the researchers that work on that for Wolverine, instead of a deer quarter up in the tree, they actually they go out in the woods and they build a ramp so that the Wolverine is in front of a camera with his arms open, and they put like a little chicken wing up here. It's a very elaborate setup, but it's all to get a picture of that chest pattern. You can see a little bit on that one. And so they're doing that work, and that could be, there's a pine marten, a cost savings where you're not sending genetic samples to the lab. But it's hard to get just the right photo. And then I have a friend who did her master's on lynx in Glacier Park, and they were trying to work on, can you identify individual lynx by the stripe on their back leg? And oh, that one's a beautiful one. Look at that patch it's up there. And there's a bobcat. I think it was a chickadee. I've had chickadees like, oh, there's a grouse, almost like sit on my head when we're putting the meat up there. Yeah. And you can see those fox are really agile.
Yeah.
It's working.
They can
Is that a red fox?
Yes, however, there also might be mountain fox, which are a different species, and as far as I'm aware, you can't really visually morphologically tell. But that could be future work to look at the genetics of those two species, whereas the red fox would be non-native to this landscape and a migrant with humans, and the mountain fox, if you're aware, there's the Sierra fox, and that again is a genetic endemic to only the Sierras, and so we might have a fox like that. So they'll sprayed a little bit, and they'll also scent rub and like rub their belly on those trees. And again, there's our little weasel. Rubbing, claiming it. Wolverine will, another important part of snow is that Wolverine, if you haven't read Doug Chadwick's book, The Wolverine Way, it's incredible. And so Wolverine will cache their food in these big, deep snow caves. And the thought is that also slows down the decomposition of that food, making it more available to the Wolverine over time. And so again, if they don't have that snow to do that, they might not be able to save food in that way. And it'll kind of rot before they can come back to it.
How many different camera sites are they looking
Ooh,
at?
this is, I think there's probably only like 5. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention. There's a coyote.
What's the camera?
So we mostly use Bushnell. We're just now switching over to Browning, and Browning definitely has some superior video quality. However, we are having a lot of trouble with Browning, and it seems like every other camera you get has some hardware, software issues. And there's some really fantastic folks that just moved to Columbia Falls. Their blog is like Winterberry Wildlife, and they're a husband-wife duo, and the husband is a retired engineer. And so he writes blogs about trail cameras if you want to go deep into it, and really, really go hard. And she's a great tracker, and so they're a really good team. But anyway, this was not the answer you were looking for. But if you're interested in trail cameras, I definitely recommend looking to those folks. There's lots of low-cost cameras on the market now if you just want to have a couple on your driveway. But like any hobby, the deeper you go and the more money you're willing to spend, you can definitely dive into some interesting directions. But yeah, these are all Bushnell. I don't remember the model, but they're pretty old now, so we're phasing them out slowly. The lynx nap a lot, like cats, and so sometimes they'll sleep in front of the cameras for hours and just trigger the camera like over and over.
Do you have any problem with the animals messing with the camera?
Bears are the worst. So they're the best and the worst. We have a lot of cameras on bear rub trees, right, where we know the bears are coming, and we will put those in metal lock boxes. Not because we're worried about people stealing them, but so that when the bears come up and bite them, they're biting the metal and they're not biting the camera. Elk often come up and like lick the camera. I don't know why deer don't do it, but elk seem to do it, and that doesn't seem to harm them. But yeah, if you get a bear in a mood, you know, we had a black bear just rip it right off the tree, and it's still on. You can see he's carrying it around in his mouth, and so it's just pointing at the sky, and then eventually he just drops it. And I don't know how we found it, but that camera was pretty toast after. He just punctured holes right into it. So yeah, I recommend if you're putting your cameras on areas you think bears are coming, invest in one of those metal protective boxes. Yeah. Winterberry Wildlife. Winterberry. Yeah, they were coming from Massachusetts. Her name is Janet Pesatero. Don't ask me to spell it. But if you Google those things, she'll come up. Yeah, they're really, really fantastic. And we actually hosted a trail camera workshop, and they taught it. So we might do it again. I did leave stickers, and if you do want to end up on Swan Valley Connections mail list to find out about things like the trail camera workshop or tracking classes, leave your email. We don't send a ton, but also you won't hurt my feelings if you get enough spam email. But ours are not spam, they're fun, right? Oh, that must have been the end. I don't think he's napping for that long. He probably is, but we wouldn't have made you watch it that long. So yeah, check out our website. We're on social media. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.